July 1st, 2026 was always supposed to be a completely quiet, entirely unremarked date on the highly rigid British royal calendar. It was the kind of deeply significant anniversary that is intentionally marked in absolute privacy by those who still carry the scars, and completely passed over publicly by an institution that has spent nearly 3 decades trying to manage a ghost. This was the specific day that Diana, Princess of Wales, would have turned 65 years old. Behind the heavy guarded gates of Kensington Palace, there were absolutely no elaborate ceremonies planned, no official commemorative portraits scheduled for release, and no formal public statements prepared for the global media. The institutional machinery of the crown had decided that the day would pass in a state of controlled, dignified silence. But by the time the evening shadows lengthened across the palace gardens, the narrative of that day no longer belonged to the public relations managers or the high-level palace courtiers. It belonged entirely to someone absolutely nobody had scripted for. A young girl who bypassed decades of rigid protocol with a single, deeply profound gesture. Princess Charlotte, at just 11 years old, did something so small, so completely unguarded, and so intensely personal that the staff and family members around her were left entirely frozen in a state of shock. And when the quiet, intimate details of what occurred behind closed doors finally began to filter out to the public, they landed with an emotional weight that absolutely nobody expected from a child. This is fundamentally not a story about a highly calculated palace tribute or a meticulously engineered public relations exercise. It is the deeply moving, psychological story of a young granddaughter who never once got the chance to meet the iconic woman she was named after, and what happened when she was finally trusted with the raw, unedited truth of who her grandmother actually was. What transpired on that quiet afternoon was not just a sweet, fleeting family moment neatly tucked away from the prying eyes of external cameras. It directly touched the most painful, unresolved conflict that the British monarchy has desperately struggled with for nearly 30 years. It directly answered the generational question of who truly gets to decide how Princess Diana is remembered, and at what exact point does that haunting memory stop being clinically managed by an institution and finally start being genuinely felt by a family. For the vast majority of Princess Charlotte's young life, the memory of Diana has existed exclusively as an abstract concept. Her grandmother was a legendary name, a historic portrait hanging in a quiet gallery, and a series of highly sanitized stories told very carefully by protective adults. But what happened on this milestone 65th birthday completely shattered that artificial distance. It changed the dynamic forever, and it did so in a beautifully chaotic way that the palace could never have orchestrated, and absolutely could never have predicted. To truly understand why this specific moment struck the family and the public with such immense force, you have to look closely at the quiet, symbolic breadcrumbs that were dropped in the weeks leading up to this birthday. It began with a remarkably subtle fashion choice that most casual observers entirely missed. A 3-strand pearl bracelet that Charlotte quietly wore as a direct, undeniable echo of her late grandmother. From that subtle visual clue, the narrative moved directly into the private, unscripted reality of the birthday itself, driven entirely by a sudden, heartbreaking request from an 11-year-old girl that absolutely nobody in the royal household saw coming. It was a request that ultimately led to an intimate, domestic scene that is said to have left even the most stoic adults in the room fighting back tears of genuine grief and realization. And finally, it forces us to confront a massive structural shift within the House of Windsor, analyzing what it truly means for the future of the crown, that Diana's volatile, emotional legacy is no longer being carried by official palace statements, curated exhibitions, or authorized biographies, but is instead being held in the gentle hands of a young girl learning the unfiltered truth of her lineage for the very first time. Diana, Princess of Wales, was brought into this world on July 1st, 1961, amidst the quiet, aristocratic privilege of Park House in Norfolk. and her turbulent, paradigm-shifting life was tragically cut short in the concrete underpass of Paris on August 31st, 1997, when she was just 36 years old. Princess Charlotte was never going to have the chance to look into her grandmother's eyes. She was born in the year 2015, a full 18 years after the catastrophic crash that permanently altered the course of modern royal history. Because of that vast generational divide, her grandmother has spent the last decade existing strictly through the medium of carefully curated photographs, highly filtered family anecdotes, and the occasional piece of historic heirloom jewelry passed down to her with immensely serious protective explanations. One of those exact heirlooms suddenly became the center of global conversation just weeks before this emotional birthday, during the high-profile Trooping the Color celebrations on June 13th. Sharp-eyed royal watchers noticed that young Princess Charlotte was wearing a stunning 3-strand pearl bracelet. The piece was strikingly identical to a legendary bracelet that Diana wore continuously throughout the late 1980s, a magnificent Nigel Milne design originally created in 1988 for the Birthright charity. The authentic, original piece currently belongs to Catherine, the Princess of Wales, who wore the historic jewelry that very same day on the palace balcony, while Charlotte stood beside her wearing a meticulously crafted matching version. It was an unmistakable, deeply deliberate visual bridge constructed between a mother and her daughter. At the time, fashion commentators called it a beautiful, quiet tribute, but absolutely few realized how much deeper that connection was about to go. As Charlotte continues to grow under the intense global spotlight, her physical and behavioral resemblance to her late grandmother has become a central point of deep fascination for seasoned royal observers. Senior experts have noted that Charlotte carries far more than just Diana's middle name. She displays sudden, unmistakable flashes of her grandmother's legendary warmth, the exact same piercing, direct eye contact when engaging with the public, and an innate, effortless ease around complete strangers that originally made Diana a global icon. According to verified reports filtering out of Adelaide Cottage, the Princess of Wales has made a highly conscious, incredibly deliberate effort in recent years to keep the spirit of Diana actively present in her children's daily lives. Catherine has fiercely refused to let Diana become a solemn, intimidating historical figure trapped behind museum glass. Instead, she has fostered an environment where George, Charlotte, and Louis are allowed to ask absolute, unscripted questions about her completely freely. This deliberate parenting choice matters immensely, because Diana was never simply a royal by title or a cardboard cutout of privilege. She was a woman who physically walked through an active, terrifying minefield in Angola to force a cold, detached world to look at the human devastation of warfare. She was the woman who reached out and warmly held the hand of a lonely man dying of AIDS in an era defined by overwhelming medical fear, ignorance, and intense social stigma. She was the mother who rigidly insisted that her young sons step outside the palace walls to see the raw reality of homelessness up close, rather than reading about it from the safe comfort of a royal library. Charlotte inherited absolutely none of that historic reality firsthand. Instead, she is inheriting it entirely secondhand, gathering the fragments of a legendary life at an age where she is finally old enough to demand real, complex answers to very real questions. That is the profound, highly charged context into which Diana's 65th birthday arrived. It was the story of a young girl standing thoughtfully at the absolute edge of a monumental legacy that she is only just beginning to comprehend, on the one specific day of the year built entirely around the memory of a woman she never got to hold. The date also arrived just over 8 weeks after Charlotte celebrated her own 11th birthday, an occasion marked by a striking new portrait taken by acclaimed royal photographer Matt Porteous. Experts watching the family's trajectory have astutely observed that Charlotte has officially crossed a psychological threshold. She is now old enough to be told the fuller, far more complex version of Diana's history. She is moving past the sanitized. fairy tale narrative reserved for very young children, and is finally being trusted with the real, heavily nuanced story, including the parts that are deeply difficult, painful, and heartbreakingly human. That profound transition from protecting a child from a painful family history to finally trusting her with the weight of it is an incredibly delicate process. And it is something the palace never announces to the world. It happens in the quiet, unscripted moments of domestic life, long before anyone on the outside even realizes a shift has occurred. According to highly placed sources close to the inner household, the events of July first unfolded in 3 distinct, incredibly quiet stages, with each successive moment becoming smaller, more intimate, and somehow infinitely heavier for the family. The very first instance involved the controversial pearl bracelet. Insiders reveal that on the morning of the anniversary, Charlotte specifically requested to wear her version of the bracelet again. Crucially, this wasn't for a grand public appearance, a formal state engagement, or a carefully staged family photograph. She requested to wear the historic heirloom for what one insider described as an entirely ordinary, completely private Wednesday spent entirely at home. There were absolutely no public duties on the schedule and no logical reason for a piece of historic jewelry to leave its secure box. Yet, she wanted it anyway. It was the very first definitive sign that this specific birthday meant something entirely different to Charlotte than any anniversary that had come before it. It wasn't a superficial choice of vanity. It was a young child deciding entirely on her own terms exactly how she wanted to physically anchor herself to the day. But the symbolic jewelry was merely the prelude to a much more profound emotional interaction. The second detail to emerge from that afternoon is even quieter and infinitely more moving. According to trusted sources within the household, Charlotte reportedly approached her mother and made a remarkably specific request. She asked Catherine to tell her a story about Diana that she had absolutely never heard before. She explicitly didn't want a headline fact that she could easily find on the internet or a rehearsed line from an official royal biography. She demanded something small, intimate, and distinctly human. Catherine reportedly obliged without hesitation, reaching deep into her own repository of private family stories to describe an ordinary, completely unmapped afternoon from the past, the exact kind of beautifully mundane detail that is systematically left out of the official historical records. One royal insider noted that in that exact moment, the carefully managed illusion of Princess Diana ceased to be a cold name printed on a historical page and became, for Charlotte, a living, breathing human being. And then came the third part of that afternoon, the specific moment that is said to have reached furthest into the emotional core of the family. According to internal reports, during their private conversation, Catherine shared the sweet, delicate detail of how Diana used to quietly collect beautiful wild flowers and carefully press them between the heavy pages of her personal books, a tiny, private domestic habit that very few people outside her immediate circle ever knew about. Upon hearing this, Charlotte reportedly looked up and asked if she could step out into the garden and try doing it herself that very afternoon. A source close to the family described an immediate, profound silence falling over the entire room the moment those words left her mouth. More than one adult present in the household was reportedly forced to turn away, visibly moved and fighting back tears. It wasn't because of the complexity of the statement. It was because of the devastating purity of who was asking and exactly why she was asking. One insider who spoke regarding the atmosphere noted that it was the closest anyone within the walls of that house had come to feeling like the spirit of Diana was genuinely, tangibly present in the room.